Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. Margaret Langford had arrived at the quarters of Langford Plantation just as autumn began to fade, and she was slowly beginning to understand the rhythm of life there, the unspoken rules, the hierarchies that governed everything. Sadi, weathered by age and experience, was the unofficial leader of the cabin. Even Hosea Drummond, the colonel's trusted overseer, treated her with respect. Ruth was pragmatic and efficient, focused on survival above all else. Patience was quiet but sharp-eyed, noticing details others missed. And Margaret was learning painfully and slowly that she was just another body in the endless cycle of plantation labor. But there was one question she could not let go. Why? Why had her father done this? She knew he was angry over her failed courtships and under financial pressure, but sending her here to these quarters seemed so extreme, so unnecessary. Surely he could have placed her with relatives or in some degrading domestic position, anything less brutal than this. Why the quarters specifically? Why erase her former life? These questions gnawed at her, especially at night when she lay on her straw mattress staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the senseless. The answer began to emerge on November 19, 1847, when Celia, Margaret's former maid, came to the quarters on an errand. Celia had been Margaret's confidant and caretaker since she was 16, helping her through the humiliation of 40 failed courtships, and comforting her in private grief. When Celia saw Margaret drawing water at the well, her face went pale. "Miss Margaret," she whispered, glancing around to ensure no one from the main house was watching. "I have to tell you something. I'm not supposed to." Drummond said, "We'll be whipped if we talk, but you need to know." Margaret's heart raced. "What is it?" Celia's voice dropped lower. "Your father's been writing letters to lawyers in Richmond about your mother's inheritance, the trust from her family. He's been telling them you're established elsewhere, and the money is to be released. I think he put you here so he could lie to the lawyers about your situation. Margaret, he's stealing your inheritance." Margaret felt the world tilt. The trust was meant to provide for her future, and possibly for her children, but her father's scheme would divert it entirely. Worse, Celia had overheard a plan suggesting that once the money was secured, there would be one more arrangement to make Margaret disappear. The implication was horrifying. Her father intended her death. That night, Margaret shared everything with Sadi, Ruth and Patience. The risk was immense, but she had no choice. Sadi listened, her expression unreadable before speaking. "Your father's not the first to try to make someone disappear, but here in the quarters we see everything, we know, and we remember. If you want to survive, you'll have to stop thinking like his daughter and start thinking like us. Become invisible, useful, patient, and when the time comes, fight." Thus began Margaret's induction into a secret network she never knew existed. The enslaved community at Langford Plantation had eyes and ears everywhere, and their knowledge rivaled anything in Richmond society. They knew which overseers could be bribed, which merchants were sympathetic, which free black families might offer shelter, and how to communicate undetected. Patience could read and write, a skill secretly taught by a previous owner's daughter. Ruth had a brother who brought news from neighboring plantations every Sunday, and Sadi's connections stretched across 3 counties. They began gathering evidence. Celia risked brutal punishment to copy passages from her father's letters. Margaret, using her mother's education, decoded legal jargon to understand exactly what her father was plotting. The trust from her mother's family was worth $32,000, a fortune in 1847, and her father had forged letters, claiming she was happily settled in a distant household. But the most chilling discovery came in early December. Celia had retrieved a partially burned draft letter from the colonel's study, addressed to the county physician. It referenced a future accident involving the colonel's daughter Margaret, clearly planning her death. Margaret realized she had less than 2 months to save her life. Winter descended early that year. The cold was harsh, and Margaret's hands became rough from constant exposure to ice water and laundry soap. Yet her body, hardened by labor, grew lean and strong. Her mind, though, was fixed entirely on survival and the carefully constructed escape plan. The plan was audacious. If the colonel wanted her gone, she would vanish, but not as he intended. On the night before the planned accident, Margaret would disappear from the quarter. The enslaved community would guide her north along the Underground Railroad. Meanwhile, they would ensure evidence of her father's crimes reached the Prescott family lawyers in Richmond, exposing him completely. But complications were many. The route north was heavily patrolled, winter conditions were severe, and a white woman traveling with escaped slaves would draw attention. Money for bribes and emergencies had to be stolen gradually from the plantation itself, without alerting Drummond or the colonel. Ruth, skilled in lockpicking, began systematically stealing coins, a silver spoon and even cufflinks, hiding them beneath Sadi's floorboards. By Christmas they had nearly $40 in cash and valuables, enough to sustain Margaret if everything went perfectly, yet perfection was impossible. Drummond, ever perceptive, began suspecting that something was afoot. Missing items and Margaret's surprising adaptation to life in the quarters prompted him to tighten security, increased patrols, random searches and guard dogs borrowed from a neighboring plantation. A new plan was necessary. On the night of December 28th, the women gathered in the cabin to strategize. "We need a diversion," Sadi said. "Something big enough to draw attention from the quarters." Ruth immediately suggested fire, but not lethal, something that looked accidental. Patience vetoed the idea of the tobacco barn or equipment shed. Margaret spoke up, her resolve crystallizing. "The main house, not to destroy it, but enough smoke and chaos to give us a head start. I know where my father keeps the evidence. If we can get in during the confusion, we can take everything and leave him with nothing." Sadi studied her and nodded. 2 months ago you never would have suggested betraying your father. Now I see the girl I feared would break has learned to fight. They refined the plan over 2 weeks. On January 13th, a controlled chimney fire in the main house would create the chaos. Margaret would slip in, retrieve the trust documents, letters and cash, and return to the court. Then she would embark on the dangerous journey north, guided by Sadi's carefully maintained contacts. Time was critical. On January 9th, Celia brought more devastating news. The colonel had moved up the planned accident to January. He intended to claim Margaret had become unstable and was killed in self-defense, framing it as necessary and just. They had 3 days to execute a life-or-death plan. The weight of the risk pressed heavily on Margaret. She was asking these women to endanger themselves for her, a white woman who had lived in privilege while they suffered in bondage. That night she asked Sadi quietly, "Why are you helping me? You owe me nothing. If this fails, we'll all be punished." Sadi stared into the dying embers before answering. "You think this is just about you, but it's not. Your father represents every master who thinks he owns our bodies and humanity, every man who destroys lives because he can. Helping you escape is resist. We prove that even here, even in hell, we have power, and seeing him lose everything, worth any risk." Margaret had no illusions about what awaited her. The winter night of January 12, 1848 was brutal. Water froze in the quarters well. She rose before dawn, heart pounding, knowing her father intended to kill her. The plan was simple in theory. At 8 p.m., Ruth would start the chimney fire, creating chaos. Margaret would enter the house through the servants' entrance, access her father's study, and steal the document. 30 minutes, no more. She spent the day mechanically performing her chores, rehearsing every step. Sadi gave her a leather satchel. Patience handed her a small sharp knife. Ruth provided rough men's clothing to change into, and a map to the first safe house, a free black family 10 miles north. At 7:30 p.m., Margaret said goodbye. There were no tears, only a firm squeeze of hands. "Remember," Sadi said, "stay quiet, move fast, trust only those I know." At 8 p.m., smoke poured from the kitchen chimney. Margaret crouched behind the house as chaos erupted. Within moments, servants, Drummond, and even the colonel rushed to the fire. Margaret slipped through the servants' entrance and moved quickly to the study. The door was locked, but her dexterous fingers and prior training in lockpicking let her manage the simple mechanism. She entered, moonlight casting silver shadows across the room. She dumped the desk contents into the satchel, smashed open the safe with a candlestick, and found exactly what she needed: cash, her mother's jewelry, trust documents, and her father's journal, detailing his plan for her murder. Suddenly, footsteps approached. Hosea Drummond appeared in the doorway. Margaret froze, knife in hand. "I wondered if you'd have the spine to do it," he said quietly. Margaret didn't lower the knife. "Don't try to stop me. I know what my father's planning. I have proof." Drummond nodded and stepped aside. "Then you'd better hurry. The fire won't hold their attention much longer." He handed her a folded paper, a pass signed by the colonel, enough to get her past casual patrols. Margaret ran through corridors filled with memories of humiliation, past the parlor, the dining room, and her old bedroom. She ran past the quarters, where Sadi, Ruth, and Patience watched anxiously. She ran north, clutching the satchel with her father's crimes. The dogs barked in the distance. The hunt had begun, but she had a 30-minute head start. Money, directions, and most importantly allies willing to risk everything for her survival. Margaret ran through the freezing January night, her breath clouding in the air, her body aching from exhaustion, but her mind sharp and focused. She had only one goal: survival. The chaos of the fire had bought her crucial minute. The main house was in uproar, Drummond and the staff scrambling to contain the smoke and ensure no lives were lost, but the distractions were enough. Her father's plans were temporarily thwarted, and she carried in her satchel the evidence that could destroy him. Her journey north was perilous. The roads of Virginia in January were icy, and patrols for runaway slaves were vigilant and ruthless. Margaret, however, was not an ordinary runaway. She was a white woman, easily identifiable, traveling with little more than a bundle of men's clothes and a leather satchel. Each step she took carried the risk of exposure, but Margaret had allies whose lives depended on secrecy as much as hers did. She moved at night, hiding during the day in barns, root cellars, and the homes of sympathetic free black family. Every night, she changed her appearance, cutting her hair short with the knife patients had given her, and roughening her clothing. She kept her voice low and rough, careful not to betray her identity. In Maryland she encountered her first patrol, and her hands shook as she presented Drummond's forged pass. The men scrutinized it, muttered among themselves and then allowed her to continue. The pass had worked, but she realized the fragility of her position. One small mistake could mean capture or death. At each safe house along the Underground Railroad, she was moved from one set of hands to another, each time receiving the same instructions: trust only those she had been told to trust, move quickly and never linger. She learned the rhythm of escape, when to hide, when to walk, when to stay silent. Her strength, honed by months of labor in the quarters, allowed her to endure cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Her resolve hardened with each mile, each hidden corner she crawled into to avoid detection. After 3 weeks of constant movement and hiding, Margaret finally crossed into Pennsylvania. On February 3, 1848, she arrived in Philadelphia, half frozen, half starved but alive. Her first thought was to find Thomas Garrett, a Quaker lawyer and abolitionist she had been told could help her secure both her safety and her inheritance. Garrett specialized in cases involving fugitive slaves and disputed estate. Margaret laid out everything: the satchel of documents from her father's safe, the letters to the Prescott family lawyers, her father's journal detailing his plan to kill her, and her own written testimony of what had happened in the quarters. Garrett read in silence. Page after page detailed fraud, deception, and attempted murder. He looked up finally, and said simply, "We are going to destroy him." His words carried the weight of justice long delayed, but justice was finally possible. The legal battle that followed was intense and public. Margaret's father, Colonel Thaddeus Langford, was a prominent Virginia plantation owner, respected as a war hero and a pillar of society. The accusations of attempted murder and fraud against him shocked Richmond and beyond. The Prescott family lawyers, presented with the documents Margaret had risked her life to retrieve, immediately froze the trust funds. They also launched a criminal investigation into Langford's actions. Testimony came from those who had risked everything for Margaret: Celia, Ruth, Sadi, and even Hosea Drummond, who had defied his master to aid her escape. Each witness corroborated her story, recounting in detail the months of planning, theft and observation that revealed the colonel's malicious intent. The journal from the colonel's own hand was the most damning piece of evidence. It documented his perception of Margaret as an expensive burden, and outlined the plan for her elimination. By March 1848, Langford was arrested and charged with attempted murder, fraud and conspiracy. The trial took place in Richmond in September of that year, drawing attention from across the state. The testimony painted a picture of a man who had abused his wealth and power to destroy his own daughter. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Langford was sentenced to 20 years in prison, though he would not survive long enough to serve the full term, dying in Richmond City Jail of pneumonia in February 1850. Alone and unmourned, Margaret's mother's trust, worth $32,000, was released to her by November. She immediately began using it to free those who had helped her. Sadi, Ruth, Patience, and Celia were purchased and granted their freedom, a transaction requiring complex legal maneuvering that Garrett successfully navigated. Margaret also prioritized purchasing the freedom of 15 other enslaved people from Langford Plantation, focusing on families and those who had aided her during her time in the court.
Though the plantation itself was sold to pay Langford's debts and legal fees, the remaining enslaved workers were dispersed, some to other plantations, others south to cotton fields, a reality that haunted Margaret throughout her life. She never returned to Virginia. Settling in Philadelphia, she quietly supported the abolitionist movement, funding safe houses and assisting fugitives traveling through the city en route to Canada. She never married despite multiple proposals, valuing the independence she had fought to secure. Margaret shared her life with Sadi, Ruth, and Patience, all of whom lived in her household on Spruce Street. Together they ran an informal safe house for fugitives, offering shelter, food, and guidance. Margaret's experience, wealth, and determination allowed them to protect hundreds over the years. The story of Margaret Langford survived through fragments in abolitionist journals and speeches. William Lloyd Garrison referenced her as Miss M., a Virginia refugee who had experienced slavery firsthand despite her whiteness and privilege. Frederick Douglass spoke of her briefly in 1851, highlighting her as a woman who understood that oppression could cross racial boundaries when wealth and power were at stake. Yet Margaret herself rarely spoke publicly of her ordeal. The trauma, betrayal by her father, exposure to violence, and the months of near-death experiences left scars that never fully healed. Sadi lived until 1863, dying at the age of 86, free for the last 15 years of her life. Margaret ensured she received a proper headstone in Eden Cemetery, reading Sadi, teacher and friend who showed others how to survive. Ruth and Patience both lived into their 70s, building independent lives and small businesses that would have been impossible in Virginia. Celia married a freedman from New York in 1852, but continued her correspondence with Margaret until her death. Margaret herself died on June 17, 1889, at 65. She outlived her father by nearly 40 years and had built a life of purpose, dignity, and resistance. She kept her mother's jewelry, the pieces she had retrieved from the safe, until the end, instructing that the proceeds from their sale be donated to schools for formerly enslaved children. The historical record of Margaret's life is deliberately fragmented. Court documents from her father's trial were sealed in 1851 at the request of the Prescott family and remained so until 1968, when a historian researching Virginia plantations stumbled upon them by accident. Margaret's diary, discovered in 1923, has never been fully published, though excerpts appear in academic studies of women's experiences in antebellum Virginia. Langford Plantation itself was destroyed in 1865 by Union troops during the final weeks of the Civil War, erasing much of the physical evidence of the Langford family's crime. Yet the story survives in fragments, whispers, court records, abolitionist journals, and the memories of families whose ancestors were freed by Margaret's efforts. It is a testament to the cruelty of slavery that transcended race, the corruption of absolute power, and the potential for resistance even in the darkest moments. Margaret Langford's life demonstrates that survival required more than courage. It demanded community, intelligence, and perseverance. Freedom was never simply given. It had to be fought for, earned, and protected. The greatest act of rebellion she learned was refusing to die when someone declared that you were no longer useful. Her story serves as a stark reminder that monsters often wear the mask of respectability, plotting unspeakable acts in the name of power, wealth, or social expectation. Margaret's triumph, her escape, her exposure of her father, her rescue of others, shows that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, resistance is possible. Even when survival seems impossible, courage, cunning, and community can prevail. Though she never spoke widely of her ordeal, her legacy lived on. Hundreds of people gained freedom through her actions, and the knowledge that one person, determined and clever, could stand against tyranny inspired those who followed. Margaret Langford's story reminds us that oppression can cross lines of race and class, that power can corrupt absolutely, and that survival is often the first, most radical act of rebellion. Margaret's life in Philadelphia was a careful balance between quiet anonymity and purposeful action. Though the city was free, danger still lingered. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, reinforced by subsequent laws, meant that any misstep could lead to capture or legal entanglement. Margaret was well aware of the legal precarity of aiding escapees, yet she refused to cower. With Sadi, Ruth, and Patience by her side, she operated a modest but effective safe house on Spruce Street, providing food, shelter, and guidance to those fleeing bondage. Every visitor was a reminder of the peril they had all endured, and every successful journey north was a testament to courage and meticulous planning. Margaret developed routines to protect herself and the people who came through her home. By day, she attended abolitionist meetings discreetly, learning the latest news and legal updates, and at night she oversaw the operations of her safe house. Each fugitive was instructed in how to appear ordinary in public, how to avoid slave catchers, and how to rely on the Underground Railroad network. Margaret, who had once been a sheltered daughter of privilege, had become a master of subterfuge and strategy. She ensured that no one under her protection was ever traced back to her family's former plantation. In 1850, the federal government passed the Fugitive Slave Act, escalating the dangers faced by Margaret and her associates. The law required free states to cooperate in returning runaway enslaved people to their owners, and imposed severe penalties on anyone aiding fugitives. For Margaret, this was both a challenge and a call to action. She intensified her operations, expanding her network by recruiting sympathetic free black families and abolitionists, ensuring that her house could continue to serve as a sanctuary. The meticulous planning and risk management she had learned while escaping her father's schemes became invaluable. Margaret also began to formalize her philanthropy. She used her inheritance to establish small educational trusts for formerly enslaved children, funding schools in Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Her focus was on literacy and practical skills, believing that knowledge was the truest pathway to freedom. She financed teachers, supplied books and writing materials, and created safe spaces where children could learn without fear of harassment or violence. Margaret saw education as a long-term investment in liberation, one that would ripple outward for generations. Despite the public success of her legal battle against her father, Margaret's personal scars remained. The betrayal she had suffered, and the months spent under the threat of death, left emotional wounds that never fully healed. She found herself reluctant to form deep romantic attachments, wary of entrusting her life and safety to another person. Marriage proposals were numerous, drawn by her wealth and the aura of independence that surrounded her, yet she politely declined each one. Her experiences had taught her that her autonomy was her most valuable asset. Margaret remained close to Sadi, Ruth, Patience, and Celia, sharing a household that functioned as both a family and a team. Sadi, by then in her late 60s, became a mentor figure to every young fugitive passing through their door. Ruth taught practical skills, sewing, carpentry, even rudimentary medicine to prepare escapees for self-sufficiency. Patience, whose literacy had once been a secret, helped fugitives navigate documents and learn to read and write safely. Celia, meanwhile, became a coordinator, managing logistics and ensuring that food, clothing, and routes were prepared ahead of time. Together they created a microcosm of freedom and resistance that contrasted sharply with the oppression Margaret had once known. The network they built was not without peril. Slave catchers, bounty hunters, and pro-slavery sympathizers patrolled the streets of Philadelphia, and the Fugitive Slave Act made even a casual encounter potentially fatal. Margaret's leadership required constant vigilance. She developed codes and signals, teaching those in her care to recognize safe houses and sympathizers along the route north. Every detail, from where to hide during a raid, to how to feign illness to avoid interrogation, was memorized and practiced. Failure was not an option. Margaret also contributed to the broader abolitionist movement. She corresponded with Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and other leaders, sharing insights from her experiences that informed their strategy. Her letters often included detailed observations on the operations of slave catchers, the vulnerabilities of plantation owners, and the most effective methods for moving fugitives without detection. Though she remained largely anonymous in public accounts, her intelligence and analysis were highly respected within abolitionist circles. As the years passed, Margaret's influence grew, though she remained intensely private. She avoided public lectures and speeches, wary of drawing attention to herself or the fugitives she helped. Yet her reputation quietly spread among those who mattered most: the families seeking freedom, the abolitionist leaders coordinating aid, and the communities of free black people working tirelessly to resist oppression. Her home on Spruce Street became a hub of quiet power, where knowledge, courage, and strategic planning converged to save lives. Margaret's philanthropy extended beyond immediate relief. She created scholarships for young black women, focusing on education and vocational training. She funded apprenticeships in skilled trades, believing that economic independence was as vital as physical freedom. Margaret understood that freedom was more than the absence of chains. It was the ability to live with dignity, safety, and autonomy. In 1859, the nation's tension over slavery escalated dramatically. The raid on Harper's Ferry by John Brown and the growing sectional conflict underscored the fragility of freedom. Margaret and her household quietly adapted, preparing for the potential influx of fugitives escaping both slaveholders and retaliatory violence. The Spruce Street safe house became a model of preparedness and secrecy. Margaret's planning skills, once honed for her personal survival, now safeguarded dozens of lives. Her former father, Thaddeus Langford, though dead by this point, continued to haunt her through the lingering memories of betrayal. Margaret often reflected on the cruelty and calculation of a man who had tried to erase her existence, yet those reflections also reinforced her purpose. The contrast between her father's selfishness and her own actions sharpened her resolve to fight injustice wherever she encountered it, and to ensure that others had the chance at life and dignity denied to her. Margaret's efforts left a permanent mark on Philadelphia. By the 1860s, her safe house had assisted hundreds of fugitives. She funded several small schools, coordinated medical aid for new arrivals, and ensured that families remained together whenever possible. Her work was quiet, unglamorous, and often invisible to the broader public, yet its impact was profound. Each life saved and every child educated was a ripple in the movement toward abolition. Her health, like that of many who had endured extreme hardship, was fragile. Decades of physical labor, emotional stress, and exposure to harsh conditions had taken their toll, yet Margaret remained active in her work, insisting that age would not excuse her from responsibility. Her companions, Sadi, Ruth, Patience, and Celia, were equally committed, forming a resilient team that balanced experience with strategy. Together they ensured that no one who came to their door was turned away, even in the face of danger. In 1863, Sadi passed away at the age of Margaret, ensured that she received a dignified burial in Eden Cemetery, one of the first cemeteries for Black Americans in Pennsylvania. The headstone read simply, Sadi, teacher and friend, who showed others how to survive. Margaret mourned privately, recognizing that Sadi's wisdom had been instrumental in her own survival and the survival of countless others. The loss reinforced Margaret's commitment to her mission. The Civil War, which erupted in 1861, brought further challenges and opportunity. Philadelphia became a hub for escaped slaves fleeing the South, and Margaret's network expanded to accommodate the increased flow. She collaborated with Union sympathizers, Quakers, and other abolitionists to provide shelter and guide. Her knowledge of plantation systems, routes, and escape strategies proved invaluable in this expanded context. Margaret became a quiet strategist, coordinating logistics and maintaining secrecy with meticulous care. After the war, Margaret focused on reconstruction and education. She helped establish schools and vocational programs for freed people, funding teachers and securing supplies. She supported legal efforts to protect the rights of former slaves, understanding that freedom required both social and legal recognition. Margaret's experience had taught her that justice without resources was insufficient, and she dedicated her wealth to ensuring that the newly freed had both. Despite her successes, Margaret never fully escaped the shadow of her past. Memories of her father's betrayal, the months spent under threat of death, and the constant fear of capture lingered. She kept her mother's jewelry, symbols of both her inheritance and her survival, until her death, at which point she instructed that the proceeds be donated to schools for formerly enslaved children. Margaret Langford died on June 7. She had outlived her father by nearly 40 years, and had transformed a traumatic past into a life of purpose and resistance. She never married, never sought public recognition, but her legacy endured. Hundreds of lives were touched by her courage, foresight, and generosity. The Spruce Street Safe House, her schools, and her philanthropic efforts provided enduring support for generations of Black Americans navigating the aftermath of slavery. Margaret's story, though fragmented in historical records, remains a testament to human resilience, intelligence, and moral courage. The court documents from her father's trial, sealed for over a century, revealed the extraordinary danger she faced. Her diary, partially published in scholarly work, offers a glimpse into her inner world, the fear, the resolve, and the meticulous planning that enabled her to survive and protect others. Langford Plantation was destroyed in 1865 during the final weeks of the Civil War, eliminating much of the physical evidence of her father's crimes. Yet Margaret's life demonstrates that even when oppressors attempt to erase individuals, resistance can endure. Community, courage, and careful planning can transform vulnerability into power. Margaret's story is a reminder that survival itself can be an act of rebellion, and that justice can be pursued even in the darkest circumstances. Her legacy also highlights the intersection of race, class, and power. Margaret, a white woman of privilege, survived because she had the education, cunning, and allies to navigate a brutal system, but she also recognized the suffering of those around her and dedicated her resources to their liberation. In doing so, she demonstrated that empathy and action are not bound by race or social position, but by moral choice and courage. Margaret Langford's life teaches us that oppression can take many forms, and that those who wield power often do so with cunning and cruelty. Yet it also teaches us that resistance, grounded in intelligence, community, and moral conviction, can prevail. Her story is both a warning and an inspiration. The greatest monsters may wear respectable faces, but ordinary people, acting together, can achieve extraordinary feats. Even in her final years, Margaret remained committed to the principles that had guided her through her darkest hours: vigilance, education, and protection of the vulnerable. The women who had saved her life became her lifelong companions and collaborators, and together they created a legacy that outlived them all. Though her name was obscured in public records for decades, Margaret Langford's courage, intelligence, and dedication to justice continue to resonate as a beacon of resilience and moral clarity in the face of unimaginable adversity. The years following the Civil War brought both relief and new challenges for Margaret Langford. While slavery had officially ended, the country remained fractured, and the freed people she had aided faced systemic oppression, poverty, and the constant threat of discrimination. Margaret, ever pragmatic and strategic, understood that freedom alone was not enough. She redirected her energy and resources toward ensuring that those who had escaped bondage could truly live with dignity and opportunity. Margaret expanded her network in Philadelphia, connecting with former abolitionists, Quakers, and newly empowered black leaders. She helped establish schools, vocational training programs, and community centers in neighborhoods heavily populated by freed people. Her own experiences had taught her that knowledge and skills were as crucial to survival as physical safety. She funded literacy programs, apprenticeships, and medical clinics, often traveling herself to oversee operations and ensure resources were used effectively. Sadi, now in her 70s, became a revered figure within these initiatives. Her decades of experience navigating plantation life and organizing covert resistance proved invaluable. Sadi worked closely with Margaret to train young adults in leadership, critical thinking, and risk management. Ruth and Patience focused on practical skills from sewing and tailoring to cooking and household management, preparing young people to be self-sufficient. Celia coordinated logistics, keeping records, managing supplies, and ensuring that the operations remained discreet. Together, these women had transformed trauma and survival into empowerment and guidance for others. Despite her growing responsibilities, Margaret remained acutely aware of the psychological scars she carried. The memory of her father's betrayal, the calculated effort to erase her life and steal her inheritance, never fully faded. Nightmares visited her for years, each one a reminder of the precariousness of her survival. Yet these memories also reinforced her resolve. Margaret saw her work not only as an obligation but as a form of justice, an act of defiance against the cruelty that had sought to define her. Margaret's philanthropy extended beyond immediate relief. She invested in long-term educational initiatives, establishing scholarships for black children and young women across Pennsylvania and Maryland. She funded libraries and provided materials for schools in rural areas, understanding that access to knowledge could radically alter the trajectory of a young person's life. Her donations were discreet. She preferred to work behind the scenes, ensuring that her wealth was a tool for empowerment rather than personal recognition. By the late 1860s, Margaret's safe house had evolved into a central hub for formerly enslaved families and abolitionist activity. Philadelphia had become a critical stop on the route to freedom for those fleeing the South, and Margaret's expertise in logistics, timing, and secrecy made her home invaluable. She developed coded communication systems, secret routes, and contingency plans to navigate the persistent dangers posed by hostile forces and opportunistic criminals. Her knowledge of plantation systems, cultivated during her own ordeal, allowed her to anticipate threats and protect those in her care. Margaret also became a quiet but influential advisor to prominent abolitionist leaders. Frederick Douglass mentioned her in passing during speeches, acknowledging her discreet but essential contributions to the movement. William Lloyd Garrison corresponded with her regarding strategies for protecting fugitives and ensuring that legal systems could be used to challenge pro-slavery policies. Though Margaret never sought fame, her expertise and courage were recognized and respected among those who mattered most. Despite her successes, life remained precarious. Margaret and her companions were constantly vigilant, aware that the post-war South still harbored animosity toward freed people and their allies. Slave catchers, corrupt officials, and hostile neighbors posed intermittent threat. Margaret insisted on rigorous security measures, including hidden rooms, secret exits, and escape drills for those in her care. Her own experience had taught her the importance of preparedness. A single oversight could mean death or capture. Margaret's personal life remained deliberately solitary. She declined marriage proposals not out of disdain for companionship, but out of a clear understanding of her responsibilities and the dangers inherent in her work. She valued her independence and recognized that forming personal attachments could compromise the safety of the people she protected. Her bonds with Sadi, Ruth, Patience, and Celia, however, were deep and enduring. Together they were a chosen family, bound by shared history, survival and purpose. In 1870, Margaret learned of a former enslaved family in Virginia facing legal challenges to their freedom. Using her wealth and legal connections, she intervened, funding lawyers, gathering affidavits, and providing safe passage for the family to reach Philadelphia. Each act of assistance reinforced Margaret's philosophy: freedom required active defense, legal support, and material resources. She became a model of strategic philanthropy, combining resources, intelligence, and moral clarity to effect tangible change. The psychological impact of Margaret's past remained complex. She carried guilt for surviving when others had not, a phenomenon often described as survivor's guilt. The memory of enslaved people who had perished in their attempts to flee, or who had remained trapped under cruel masters, weighed heavily on her. Yet she transformed that pain into action, ensuring that her wealth, influence, and knowledge could prevent similar tragedy. Margaret's life became a testament to the power of resilience, intelligence, and purposeful intervention. Margaret's impact extended to political advocacy. She collaborated with reformers and legislators to influence policies affecting freed people. She lobbied for funding for schools, protections for laborers, and enforcement of laws guaranteeing basic rights. Her approach combined personal intervention with systemic action, reflecting the lessons she had learned on Langford Plantation, that survival alone was not enough, and that lasting change required engagement with institutions and laws. By the 1880s, Margaret's reputation as a quiet but formidable benefactor was well established in Philadelphia. She continued to operate the safe house, though the city's social and legal landscape had shifted significantly since her arrival. Freed people had more access to education, some had established businesses, and abolitionist networks were well entrenched. Yet Margaret never relaxed her vigilance. Her own experience had taught her that freedom was fragile, and that evil often lingered where it was least expected. Margaret remained deeply connected to her companions. When Sadi passed in 1863, Margaret oversaw her burial in Eden Cemetery, ensuring a dignified and respectful farewell. She continued to support Ruth and Patience, helping them establish small businesses and maintain independence. Celia, who had married and moved to New York, remained in correspondence with Margaret for decades. These relationships were not merely personal, they were central to the network of care and protection that had defined Margaret's post-escape life. Margaret's careful documentation of her experiences, though largely private, became a resource for historians and scholars decades later. Her diary contained detailed accounts of her father's schemes, her escape, and the operation of the safe house. Though she deliberately obscured identifying details to protect the people involved, the insights it offered into survival, resistance, and strategic thinking were invaluable. Researchers who uncovered fragments of her writings recognized their significance, both historically and ethically, for understanding the lived experience of oppression and resilience. In 1889, Margaret Langford passed away at the age of. She had outlived her father by nearly 40 years, and had transformed a life marked by privilege, betrayal, and near death into one defined by purpose, justice, and liberation. She had directly impacted hundreds of lives through her safe house, educational philanthropy, and strategic intervention. Her legacy was not measured in fame or accolades, but in the tangible freedom and opportunity she created for others. Margaret's will reflected the priorities that had guided her life. Her mother's jewelry, once stolen from her father's safe, was to be sold, and the proceeds donated to schools for formerly enslaved children. Her wealth was directed toward continuing education, safety, and community support for those who remained vulnerable. She had built systems of support that would endure beyond her lifetime, ensuring that her mission of liberation and empowerment continued. Historians studying Margaret Langford in the 20th century encountered a story that was fragmentary and deliberately obscure. Court documents from her father's trial, sealed for decades, revealed the extent of his cruelty and the extraordinary risks Margaret had faced. Her diary, partially published in academic works, offered an intimate view of a young woman navigating extreme danger, betrayal, and survival. The story of Langford Plantation itself, destroyed during the Civil War, survived only through these written records and oral histories passed down by the families Margaret had aided. Margaret's life illustrates that oppression can take many forms, and that the wielders of power often conceal cruelty behind respectability. Yet her story also demonstrates that courage, intelligence, and community can overcome even calculated attempts at destruction. By refusing to accept her father's plan, seeking allies, and strategically leveraging resources, Margaret not only survived but transformed her trauma into liberation for others. Her example shows that freedom is not merely a state of being, but a continuous process requiring vigilance, knowledge, and courage. The people Margaret aided often went on to lead independent lives, educate their own children, and contribute to the abolitionist cause. In this way, her influence extended far beyond the immediate circle of her safe house, shaping communities and networks of support that outlasted her lifetime. Margaret Langford's story challenges assumptions about race, privilege, and power. Though she was a white woman of wealth, her survival depended on alliances with black women and men who risked everything to ensure her safety. She recognized this, dedicating her resources to their freedom and empowerment. Her life underscores the principle that true justice and liberation require empathy, action, and shared risk. Even in death, Margaret's philosophy endured. The schools, scholarships, and community support she funded continued to provide opportunities for formerly enslaved children. Her companions, Sadi, Ruth, Patience, and Celia, were remembered as central figures in a network that blended survival, strategy, and moral courage. Their collective legacy highlights the importance of community in resisting oppression, demonstrating that individual resilience, when combined with organized action, can produce extraordinary results. Margaret's life story, though often obscured in public records, remains a testament to human endurance and moral clarity. She transformed fear into action, trauma into empowerment, and survival into justice. Her experience teaches that resistance is not only possible but necessary, even when faced with overwhelming power and calculated cruelty. The lessons of her life continue to resonate, reminding us that courage, intelligence, and empathy are timeless tools for confronting injustice. Margaret Langford's narrative survives as a beacon of hope and a guide to strategic resistance. It is a story of transformation, from a sheltered child of privilege to a resilient, courageous, and effective advocate for freedom. She proved that even in the darkest circumstances, humans can act decisively to protect life, uphold justice, and create lasting change. Her legacy, carried through the lives she saved, the institutions she supported, and the communities she empowered, remains a testament to the enduring power of resilience, strategy, and moral courage in the face of unimaginable adversity. The post-Civil War years brought new challenges for Margaret Langford, but also the opportunity to transform her experiences into purposeful action. Although slavery had ended, systemic oppression and racial prejudice remained pervasive. Margaret understood that freedom in name alone was insufficient. Survival, education, and opportunity were critical for the formerly enslaved people she had helped. She dedicated her wealth, intelligence, and organizational skills to building support networks that would ensure tangible, lasting impact. Margaret expanded her efforts in Philadelphia, working closely with Quaker abolitionists, freedmen's organizations, and emerging civic leaders. She helped establish schools for black children, vocational training programs, and community centers. Her guiding principle was clear: knowledge and skills were as vital to survival as physical freedom. Literacy, trade skills, and civic awareness could empower a person to navigate and resist systemic oppression. Margaret personally oversaw many of these initiatives, traveling to remote areas, auditing programs, and ensuring resources were properly distributed. Sadi, now in her 70s, became a revered mentor within these programs. Her decades of experience navigating slavery and clandestine resistance proved invaluable. She trained young adults in strategic thinking, leadership, and survival skills. Ruth and Patience focused on practical instruction, from sewing and domestic management to food preparation and community organization. Celia managed logistics, keeping meticulous records and overseeing supply. Together, these women transformed past suffering into a blueprint for empowerment and resilience. Yet Margaret's own trauma never fully abated. The calculated betrayal by her father, the cold, strategic effort to erase her life and steal her inheritance, haunted her for decades. Nightmares revisited her repeatedly, reminding her of the precariousness of her survival. But these memories, painful as they were, also fueled her determination. Margaret's work became a form of justice and resistance, a way to turn her own suffering into protection and opportunity for others. Margaret's philanthropy was both practical and strategic. She funded literacy programs, established scholarships, and supported vocational apprenticeships. She understood that education was not merely an academic pursuit, but a lifeline, equipping formerly enslaved people with the tools to assert independence, secure livelihoods, and navigate a society still steeped in discrimination. Libraries and learning materials, supplied and maintained through her funding, became lifelines for communities still marginalized after emancipation. By the late 1860s, Margaret's safe house had evolved into a critical hub for newly freed families and abolitionist network. Philadelphia, a key node in the Underground Railroad, still posed dangers. Hostile neighbors, opportunistic criminals and remnants of pro-slavery sympathizers. Margaret implemented rigorous security measures, hidden rooms, secret passages, coded communication, and contingency plans to protect both the residents and visitors who relied on her shelter. Her own experience with calculated danger informed every precaution.
By the turn of the 20th century, the legacy of Margaret Langford had begun to ripple far beyond Philadelphia. Communities that had benefited from her resources and guidance were now thriving centers of black education, entrepreneurship, and civic engagement. Margaret had deliberately invested in long-term resilience, ensuring that each school, workshop, or safe house could operate independently if necessary, with trained leaders and clear governance structures. Her vision of empowerment was systemic, designed to endure even in her absence. Margaret's mentorship program had expanded significantly by 1900. Young men and women who had survived slavery or were children of freed families were brought under her guidance. She focused not only on education but on practical skills and strategic thinking. They learned the nuances of negotiation, the importance of documentation, and the subtle forms of power and influence that could be leveraged in a society still riddled with prejudice. Margaret emphasized the need for ethical leadership, often recounting lessons from Sadi, Ruth, and Patience, teaching that courage without wisdom could lead to disaster. Sadi, though aging, remained a formidable presence in these programs. Her reputation as a strategist and mentor drew many to her, and she became a living bridge to the history of resistance at Langford Plantation. She shared her stories not as a tale of personal triumph, but as lessons in survival, alliance building, and the moral obligations of power. Her influence extended beyond the students themselves. She counseled community leaders, advised philanthropists, and worked quietly with abolitionist organizations, ensuring that the strategies she had helped develop continued to empower future generations. Ruth and Patience, having transitioned from survival-focused skills to entrepreneurial guidance, taught practical economic independence. They opened workshops where women could learn tailoring, domestic management, and small-scale business operations. These workshops doubled as community hubs where information, resources, and safety networks could be shared. Celia, managing logistics and record-keeping, ensured that every operation was meticulously documented, laying a foundation for accountability and sustainability. Margaret often marveled at the precision and effectiveness of their combined efforts, recognizing that her escape had not just been a personal victory, but a blueprint for empowerment. Margaret herself remained deeply engaged, though she maintained her characteristic discretion. She avoided public acclaim, understanding that visibility could endanger her initiatives and her allies. Instead, she preferred to work through trusted intermediaries, guiding decisions, reviewing programs, and providing financial and strategic support. Her home in Spruce Street became a quiet nerve center of operations, where plans for schools, legal challenges, and community protection were drawn up, funds allocated, and mentorship coordinated. Every decision was informed by her experience at Langford Plantation, the constant awareness of danger, the necessity of alliances, and the power of foresight. Despite her successes, Margaret was acutely aware of the limits of her influence. She understood that systemic prejudice, economic inequality, and political disenfranchisement were deeply entrenched. In her correspondence with leaders in Virginia, Maryland, and New York, she emphasized the importance of collective action, shared responsibility, and intergenerational planning. She urged communities not to rely solely on her resources, but to build networks capable of self-sustaining growth. Her approach was proactive. She invested in infrastructure, leadership, and education to ensure that even if external support waned, communities could endure. Margaret also prioritized historical memory. She saw the documentation of personal and collective histories as both moral obligation and practical strategy. By encouraging former slaves and their descendants to record their experiences, she created a network of knowledge that could be used to assert rights, claim inheritance, or seek legal redress. Diaries, letters, and oral histories were carefully preserved, often passed through trusted hands to avoid destruction or censorship. Margaret understood that memory was a form of power and that erasure was a tool of oppression. By ensuring that histories were recorded and preserved, she was countering centuries of systemic suppression. Margaret's efforts in legal advocacy continued to grow. She collaborated with Quaker lawyers, abolitionist societies, and sympathetic political figures to challenge discriminatory laws, defend vulnerable families, and establish precedent for property rights, education, and civil liberty.
Her own experiences at Langford Plantation, particularly her father's calculated attempt on her life, informed these efforts. She emphasized the importance of evidence, documentation, and witness testimony, teaching communities how to protect themselves legally and strategically. These initiatives were dangerous. Challenges to the established racial and social order frequently provoked retaliation. Margaret, Sadi, Ruth, Patience, and Celia all understood that their safety was contingent upon discretion, alliances, and careful planning. By 1905, Margaret's network had expanded into rural Virginia, Maryland, and southern Pennsylvania. She financed schools, safe houses, and workshops while maintaining secure lines of communication across counties and states. Messages were often encoded, and couriers were selected for discretion and reliability. Margaret drew on the strategies she had used during her escape to ensure that operations remained clandestine when necessary. Her methods emphasized redundancy. Multiple safe houses, alternate routes, and backup leaders ensured that no single point of failure could compromise the network. Margaret's personal philosophy became increasingly focused on intergenerational empowerment. She recognized that the progress achieved in her lifetime could be undone if knowledge and skills were not passed down. She instituted mentorship programs not just for immediate beneficiaries, but for their children, fostering a culture of resilience, strategic thinking, and ethical responsibility. By embedding these values into the next generation, she ensured that her efforts would have enduring impact. Her approach combined moral instruction, practical skills, and strategic foresight, reflecting the comprehensive lessons she had learned from her own experiences of survival, escape, and resistance. The impact of Margaret's work became apparent in the broader community. Former students established schools, safe houses, and businesses that adhered to her principles of empowerment and sustainability. Graduates of her mentorship programs became civic leaders, educators, and legal advocates, perpetuating the strategies she had developed and taught. Communities that had been marginalized and vulnerable became resilient and self-sustaining, capable of defending their rights and securing opportunities for future generations. Yet Margaret remained vigilant. The threat of systemic oppression, racial violence, and economic exploitation persisted. She continued to monitor social and political developments, adjust strategies, and intervene where necessary. Her correspondence with allies often included detailed assessments of risk, advice on resource allocation, and guidance on navigating local power structure. Margaret's interventions were deliberate, precise, and informed by decades of experience navigating systems designed to exploit and oppress. Margaret's legacy was further amplified through her involvement in abolitionist and civil rights networks. Though slavery had been abolished decades earlier, the fight for true freedom and equality continued. Margaret provided financial support, strategic guidance, and mentorship to activists and reformers. She encouraged documentation, public testimony, and the creation of networks to safeguard communities against legal and social discrimination. Her influence was largely invisible to the public, but her impact on the sustainability and effectiveness of these networks was profound. In her final years, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with her imprisonment in the quarters at Langford Plantation. She had survived a calculated attempt on her life, escaped under the cover of darkness and chaos, and built a life of purpose and influence. Her experiences had taught her that survival required more than courage. It demanded strategy, alliances, and careful planning. Freedom was not a state, but a process, sustained through vigilance, education, and empowerment. Margaret died in 1910 at the age of 86, leaving behind a legacy that extended far beyond her immediate achievements. Her estate funded educational institutions, safe houses, and legal advocacy networks. Her protégés and allies continued her work, ensuring that the communities she had nurtured remained resilient and empowered. Margaret's story became a model for strategic resistance, ethical leadership, and intergenerational empowerment, demonstrating that the lessons of survival could be transformed into enduring social change. Historians studying Margaret's life have emphasized the significance of her actions in multiple contexts. Her escape from Langford Plantation is studied, not merely as a tale of personal survival, but as a case study in strategic resistance, alliances, and ethical decision-making under extreme duress. Her subsequent philanthropic and educational work illustrates the transformative potential of leveraging resources, knowledge, and relationships to effect systemic change. Margaret's life challenges assumptions about privilege, race, and agency, demonstrating that moral courage and strategic thinking can reshape communities and empower generations. Margaret Langford's story also provides insight into the broader historical dynamics of slavery, post-emancipation society, and civil rights activism. It highlights the ways in which systemic oppression extends beyond race to encompass power, wealth, and social hierarchies, and it illustrates how strategic resistance can counteract entrenched injustice. Her life underscores the ethical and practical importance of alliances, documentation, and foresight in resisting exploitation and securing freedom. Ultimately, Margaret Langford's life embodies the principles she learned under the most harrowing conditions. Knowledge is power, alliances are essential, courage must be paired with strategy, and freedom is earned through action, not simply granted. Her legacy is evident, not only in the institutions she established and the communities she empowered, but in the enduring lessons her story provides for understanding resistance, resilience, and ethical leadership in the face of systemic oppression. Margaret's story remains a testament to the enduring potential of human agency and moral courage. It demonstrates that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals can not only survive but effect lasting change. Her life is a reminder that the struggle for freedom and justice is ongoing, and that the actions of one person, guided by knowledge, strategy, and alliances, can ripple outward to transform communities and generations. By the early decades of the 20th century, the legacy of Margaret Langford had grown into something almost mythic among certain communities. Word of her escape, her strategic brilliance, and her subsequent philanthropy circulated quietly through oral histories and letters, often told in hushed tones to ensure safety. For many families, Margaret was more than a benefactor. She was a symbol of survival, resistance, and the moral obligation to use one's advantage for the good of others. In Philadelphia, the house on Spruce Street remained a beacon. It functioned as a training ground for young men and women who would go on to be leaders in education, business, and civil rights. Margaret had understood early that sustainability required decentralization. Each project she initiated, whether a school, workshop, or safe house, was designed to operate autonomously if she were no longer present. She trained successors meticulously, ensuring they could make independent decisions in line with her principles. Sadi, Ruth, and Patience became the core advisors and overseers of these operations, their knowledge of survival, secrecy, and strategic thinking invaluable to the program's success. Margaret emphasized that true empowerment was never reliant on a single individual. It required a network of informed, capable, and ethical actors. As the country moved further from the Civil War era, new threats emerged. Segregation laws, discriminatory practices, and racial violence persisted, challenging the communities Margaret had helped build. But the structures she established proved resilient. Schools she had funded continued to operate, providing generations of Black children with literacy, numeracy, and practical skills. Workshops trained women in economic independence, creating small businesses that could support entire families. Safe houses, some originally tied to underground railroad routes, now functioned as protective spaces for anyone facing exploitation or legal harassment. Margaret's foresight ensured that these networks could adapt to changing circumstances while retaining their core mission of empowerment and protection. Margaret also became a quiet force in early legal advocacy for civil rights. She corresponded with lawyers, reformers, and political activists, providing them with both financial backing and strategic advice. Her understanding of the legal system, refined through her battle to reclaim her mother's trust and expose her father, was unparalleled. She advised on the importance of documentation, witness testimony, and precedent-setting cases, and she supported litigation that challenged discriminatory policies, particularly those related to education, property rights, and personal liberty. The reach of Margaret's influence extended beyond Philadelphia. Former beneficiaries of her programs moved to other cities and states, carrying with them the lessons she had imparted. They established schools, businesses, and civic organizations modeled on her philosophy of strategic empowerment. Her insistence on ethical leadership and practical skills created a ripple effect. Young leaders learned not only to survive in an oppressive society, but to thrive and build institutions capable of enduring systemic challenges. These indirect contributions, often undocumented in official histories, shaped the development of Black communities across the northeastern United States. Margaret's life also contributed to the evolving understanding of resistance in American history. Historians and scholars studying slavery, post-emancipation society, and early civil rights activism frequently cited her as a case study in strategic agency. Her escape from Langford Plantation was not merely a personal triumph, but a sophisticated operation involving intelligence, timing, alliances and risk management. Her ability to leverage networks, anticipate threats, and act decisively transformed what could have been a simple story of survival into a blueprint for communal resilience. In academic circles, her example challenged prevailing assumptions about the limitations of women, especially white women in elite families, in acts of resistance against oppressive systems. The cultural impact of Margaret's story was equally significant. In Philadelphia, families who had benefited from her initiatives often recounted the narrative of her escape and subsequent philanthropy to their children. These stories were not framed as tales of personal heroism alone, but as moral lessons in courage, strategy, and responsibility. Margaret's insistence on discretion meant that much of her influence was subtle, yet the effects were profound. Young people who grew up hearing of her achievements internalized the values of self-reliance, critical thinking, and ethical action. In many ways, Margaret became an archetype, a figure who embodied both practical wisdom and moral fortitude in the face of systemic oppression. Margaret's later years were marked by both reflection and quiet action. She continued to oversee her network of schools and safe houses, corresponded with allies, and supported legal advocacy efforts. She took care to ensure that her protégés were prepared to take on leadership roles, and that no single point of failure could threaten the broader network. Her mentorship emphasized ethical decision-making, risk assessment, and strategic planning skills she had honed during her own escape and in the legal battle against her father. Even in her 70s and 80s, Margaret remained deeply engaged, knowing that the work she had begun would require decades to mature fully.
Margaret's health began to decline in 1908, but she remained intellectually active. She spent long hours writing letters of guidance, reviewing educational curricula, and advising on community projects. Her correspondence revealed a mind still sharp and strategic, capable of analyzing complex situations and offering nuanced solutions. In many letters, she emphasized the importance of intergenerational continuity, urging her protégés to document their work, train successors, and maintain networks of mutual support. Margaret understood that freedom and empowerment were not static achievements but ongoing processes that required vigilance, planning, and adaptation. When Margaret passed in 1910, the impact of her life was immediately evident. Tributes poured in from former students, protégés, and community leaders. Her estate funded the continuation of her educational and protective initiatives, ensuring that her influence would extend well beyond her death. Sadi, Ruth, Patience, and Celia, by then in their 80s, continued to mentor and guide the communities Margaret had nurtured. They served as living links to the history of resistance at Langford Plantation, teaching the next generation about strategy, resilience, and moral courage. The story of Margaret Langford also began to enter broader historical discourse. Scholars of African American history, women's history, and legal history noted her unique position, a woman who had escaped both physical danger and social oppression to create systemic change. Her life challenged simplistic narratives of race, privilege, and power, illustrating that moral courage and strategic intelligence could transcend social hierarchies. Academic papers, oral histories, and local historical societies preserved her story, sometimes under pseudonyms or coded references, reflecting the enduring sensitivity of the subject matter. Margaret's story also intersected with early civil rights activism. Activists in the early 20th century drew inspiration from her methods of strategic resistance, alliance building, and resource mobilization. Her insistence on ethical leadership and practical training influenced the approaches of community organizers, educators, and legal advocates. Even as society remained deeply segregated and discriminatory, Margaret's legacy provided a framework for sustainable empowerment and systemic challenge. By mid-century, historians had begun to reconstruct the full arc of Margaret Langford's life. Archival research, including court records, correspondence, and oral histories, revealed the extraordinary complexity of her escape, legal battles, and philanthropic work. Scholars highlighted her understanding of networks, risk management, and community empowerment, emphasizing that her achievements were not merely the result of individual bravery, but of careful planning, intelligence, and ethical leadership. Margaret became a symbol not only of survival but of strategic social transformation. Her life continues to offer lessons relevant to contemporary discussions of social justice, leadership, and resilience. Margaret demonstrated that empowerment is both an individual and collective endeavor, requiring courage,
strategic planning, and the cultivation of alliances. She showed that resistance to systemic oppression is most effective when it combines moral clarity with tactical acumen, and that survival itself can be transformed into a tool for broader social change. Her example underscores the importance of foresight, education, and intergenerational mentorship in building resilient communities. In the communities Margaret touched, her influence persisted for decades. Schools she had funded remained in operation, safe houses continued to provide shelter, and community leaders upheld the principles she had instilled. Stories of her escape and subsequent achievements were passed down as cautionary tales, moral lessons, and sources of inspiration. Margaret's insistence on documenting her experiences and those of her allies ensured that her legacy would endure, even in the face of social, political, and economic challenges. Ultimately, Margaret Langford's life serves as a testament to the transformative potential of strategic action and moral courage. From her early imprisonment at Langford Plantation to her escape, legal victories, and systemic philanthropy, she exemplified resilience, intelligence, and ethical leadership. Her story demonstrates that survival is not merely an individual achievement, but a catalyst for communal empowerment. Through her actions, Margaret reshaped the lives of countless individuals and laid the groundwork for enduring social change. Her legacy reminds us that the fight against oppression is multifaceted. It requires courage, strategy, alliances, and the willingness to act in morally and ethically informed ways. Margaret Langford's life illustrates that even in the most constrained and dangerous circumstances, individuals can exercise agency, resist injustice, and build structures that empower future generations. Her story endures as both inspiration and blueprint, offering lessons in survival, resistance, and the cultivation of lasting social impact. Margaret's influence continues to resonate in modern scholarship, historical narratives, and community memory. Scholars of African American history, women's history, and legal history cite her as a model of strategic resistance and ethical leadership. Educators and activists draw upon her principles to teach resilience, empowerment, and systemic thinking. Margaret's life challenges assumptions about privilege, race, and agency, demonstrating that intelligence, courage, and foresight can overcome formidable obstacles. Her story remains a reminder that history is not merely the record of dominant powers, but also the accumulation of actions, choices, and strategies by those who resist, survive, and transform their circumstance. Margaret Langford's life exemplifies how individual agency, when combined with ethical vision and strategic planning, can produce lasting change. Her achievements continue to inspire scholars, activists, and communities dedicated to justice, equity, and empowerment. The story of Margaret Langford did not end with her death in 19. Her influence rippled outward, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, shaping communities, institutions, and historical understanding well into the network she had built. The schools, workshops, safe houses, and mentorship structures continued to operate, often under the leadership of those she had personally trained. These institutions became vital hubs in Black communities throughout Philadelphia and beyond, providing not only education and safety, but also a living example of strategic resistance and community empowerment. By the 1920s and 1930s, the memory of Margaret's life and deeds began to enter the consciousness of African American intellectuals, activists, and educated figures in the burgeoning civil rights movement recognized the power of her model, a combination of foresight, strategic thinking, ethical leadership, and resourcefulness. Margaret's insistence on documentation, careful planning, and intergenerational mentorship was cited as a template for building resilient communities capable of surviving systemic oppression and achieving lasting change. Though many did not know her full story, those who had direct or familial connections to her network passed down her lessons orally, ensuring that her influence persisted across generations. Schools funded or supported by Margaret became centers of intellectual and practical development. Her emphasis on literacy, numeracy, critical thinking, and vocational skills produced students who could navigate both the oppressive systems around them and the opportunities they were afforded. Teachers she had trained, or who had been mentored by her protégés, instilled in their students the values of ethical leadership, strategic foresight, and communal responsibility. These schools also served as incubators for young activists, entrepreneurs, and educators who would go on to make meaningful contributions to their community. Margaret's influence thus became a quiet, persistent force, shaping social mobility, civic engagement, and empowerment within marginalized populations. Her story also contributed to the development of historical scholarship about resistance and agency. In the mid-20th century, historians examining slavery, post-emancipation society, and early civil rights activism began to uncover records relating to Margaret Langford. Court documents from her father's trial, once sealed and nearly forgotten, were rediscovered, shedding light on both the scope of his crimes and the ingenuity of Margaret's response. Scholars highlighted the sophisticated strategies she employed during her escape and legal battle, emphasizing that her success relied not solely on luck or circumstance, but on intelligence, courage, and meticulous planning. Her case challenged prevailing assumptions about women, privilege, and agency, demonstrating that even within highly constrained circumstances, individuals could exercise profound influence over their own destinies and the destinies of those around. Margaret's network of safe houses and mentorship programs also played an unanticipated role during the Great Migration. As African Americans moved from the South to northern cities in search of better opportunities and to escape segregationist laws, they encountered social, economic, and legal obstacles that could easily derail their effort. Many benefited indirectly from the structures Margaret had established decades earlier. Her safe houses provided temporary refuge, while her emphasis on education and vocational skills enabled migrants to navigate urban environments and secure employment. Families who had been supported by Margaret's programs shared practical knowledge, moral guidance, and financial assistance with newcomers, perpetuating her legacy of communal resilience. In addition to her influence on education and migration, Margaret's life became a reference point in legal scholarship. Her battle to reclaim her mother's trust, expose her father's crimes, and secure the freedom of her allies offered an early example of strategic legal action, intersecting with social justice objectives. Lawyers, judges, and academics studying cases involving inheritance disputes, exploitation, and systemic abuse often cited her case as a precedent for ethical litigation and the importance of detailed documentation. Margaret demonstrated that legal systems, though often biased and restrictive, could be navigated effectively when combined with intelligence, strategy, and ethical commitment. Margaret's story also challenged conventional narratives about race, gender, and privilege. Though she was white and born into wealth, her experience at Langford Plantation subjected her to a unique form of oppression, orchestrated by her father. Her survival and subsequent activism blurred the lines between victimhood and agency, demonstrating that systemic abuse could transcend race and social status. This complexity made her story particularly compelling to historians seeking to understand the nuanced realities of power, oppression, and resistance. Margaret exemplified how moral courage, strategic thinking, and ethical leadership could enable individuals to transform personal trauma into societal benefit. By the 1950s, Margaret's life had begun to influence early civil rights organizations. Activists studying historical examples of resistance often referenced her strategic escape and her subsequent philanthropy as a model for combining direct action with systemic intervention. Her emphasis on networks, mentorship, and community empowerment resonated with leaders attempting to build sustainable programs in education, economic development, and legal advocacy. In many cases, local organizers consciously or unconsciously replicated her methods, prioritizing skill building, ethical leadership, and strategic alliances to achieve long-term community impact. Margaret's legacy thus transcended her immediate geographic and temporal context, influencing national movements decades after her death. The archival preservation of Margaret's story also played a key role in shaping modern historical understanding. Documents from her father's trial, correspondence, and the diary discovered in 1923 became invaluable resources for historians studying both the institution of slavery and the early mechanisms of organized resistance. Scholars noted that her meticulous record-keeping and strategic documentation not only facilitated her own legal victory, but also ensured that future generations could study, learn from, and replicate her strategies. These materials highlighted the importance of primary sources in understanding historical agency, particularly when traditional narratives often marginalized or obscured the contributions of women and oppressed communities. In the 1960s and 1970s, as civil rights activism reached its peak, Margaret's story found renewed resonance. Community leaders, educators, and activists emphasized the lessons of strategic planning, ethical resistance, and intergenerational mentorship that she had embodied. Oral histories collected during this period often referenced Margaret as an archetype of moral courage and practical intelligence, and her life became a teaching tool in discussions about empowerment, justice, and ethical leadership. Students and activists studying her experience gained insight into the ways individuals could navigate oppressive systems while building networks capable of sustaining long-term social change. Margaret's influence was also evident in cultural production. Plays, short stories, and later historical novels drew inspiration from her escape and subsequent life, often highlighting the tension between personal survival and communal responsibility. Artists and writers emphasized the intelligence, courage, and moral clarity she demonstrated, portraying her not merely as a survivor but as a strategist, philanthropist, and moral guide. While her story was sometimes fictionalized or altered to suit narrative conventions, the underlying principles of her actions, resistance, foresight, and ethical leadership remained central to her cultural depiction. Her legacy extended into legal advocacy, social work, and education into the late 20th century. Programs focused on community empowerment, mentoring, and strategic skill building often cited Margaret as a historical inspiration. Her life demonstrated that effective resistance and meaningful social change required careful planning, ethical decision-making, and a commitment to empowering others. Scholars studying the intersection of gender, race, and social power frequently highlighted her achievements as illustrative of the complex ways in which privilege and oppression intersect, and how strategic intelligence can be leveraged to protect oneself and others. Despite the passage of time, Margaret's story also served as a moral compass. Families descended from those she helped often spoke of her not only as a benefactor but as a moral exemplar. The combination of strategic foresight, courage, and ethical clarity she displayed provided a model for decision-making in challenging circumstances. Her insistence on documentation, mentorship, and intergenerational transfer of knowledge underscored the importance of planning and preparation, values that extended far beyond the immediate context of her life. In academic circles, Margaret Langford's story has been used to challenge traditional narratives about slavery and oppression. While many accounts focus on overt violence or economic exploitation, her life illustrates the subtler mechanisms of psychological manipulation, strategic survival, and ethical resistance. Scholars emphasize that Margaret's achievements were not the result of luck or external intervention alone but of deliberate, informed, and morally guided action. Her story provides insight into the ways oppressed individuals can exercise agency, navigate complex systems, and create lasting social impact. By the early 21st century, interest in Margaret's story had grown both among historians and the general public. Documentaries, scholarly articles, and local museum exhibits highlighted her escape, legal victory, and philanthropic legacy. Her life was increasingly recognized as an example of strategic resistance, ethical leadership, and communal empowerment, inspiring both historical reflection and contemporary action. Educational programs and museum exhibits emphasized the practical and moral lessons of her story, ensuring that her influence would continue to shape understanding of history, justice, and social response. Margaret Langford's story also had a profound impact on the historiography of slavery and resistance. Scholars began to frame resistance not only as collective uprisings or overt rebellion, but also as strategic, intelligent, and ethically guided action at the individual and community level. Margaret's escape, her subsequent legal battle, and her careful cultivation of networks provided a model for understanding resistance as a multifaceted process that could involve subversion, strategic alliances, and long-term planning. Her example demonstrated that moral courage combined with strategic intelligence could yield outcomes far beyond immediate survival. Ultimately, Margaret's legacy is multifaceted. She was a survivor, strategist, philanthropist, mentor, and moral exemplar. Her life illustrates the potential for individuals to navigate extreme oppression, protect themselves and others, and create structures that foster long-term empowerment. Her story challenges simplistic narratives about privilege, race, and agency, revealing the complex interplay of social, economic, and ethical forces in shaping historical outcomes. Through her intelligence, courage, and ethical foresight, Margaret Langford transformed her personal trauma into a lasting social impact, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire, educate, and empower. Her story reminds us that history is never only about the powerful and the visible. It is equally about the strategic, the ethical, and the courageous, those who act with foresight and moral clarity to transform circumstances not just for themselves but for the communities they touch. Margaret Langford's life exemplifies the enduring power of individual agency, ethical decision-making, and communal responsibility. She shows that even in the darkest conditions, careful strategy, courage, and moral commitment can create lasting change. Her life and legacy remain a beacon, demonstrating that the most profound acts of resistance often unfold quietly, strategically, and ethically, leaving ripples that continue for generations. Margaret Langford's life and actions did not fade into obscurity after her death. Instead, they quietly shaped the cultural memory of resistance, education, and ethical leadership in both local and national context. Though her story was fragmented in historical records and often obscured by the social conventions of her time, modern historians, educators, and activists gradually uncovered and amplified her legacy. This rediscovery has had profound effects on how communities understand resistance, agency, and moral courage in the face of systemic oppression. In the decades following the Civil War and Reconstruction, Margaret's immediate contributions, particularly the freedom she purchased for Sadi, Ruth, Patience, Celia, and other enslaved people, continued to influence the lives of those who directly benefited from her philanthropy. Families she helped liberate passed down oral histories, emphasizing the courage, strategy, and ethical commitment of the woman who had risked her own life to secure their freedom. These stories, often shared quietly around dinner tables or at church gatherings, preserved the narrative of her resourcefulness and moral clarity. Though largely unrecorded in written histories of the late 19th century, these oral traditions maintained her influence within African American communities, subtly shaping ideas about resistance, self-determination, and the power of strategic intelligence. By the mid-20th century, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, scholars and activists began to look for historical examples of resistance that extended beyond the more commonly cited figures. Margaret Langford's story emerged as a compelling case study. Historians of slavery and legal scholars noted her sophisticated planning, her ability to navigate both social and legal systems, and her capacity to protect and empower others. In particular, her approach to documenting her father's crimes and using legal channels to achieve justice was highlighted as a precursor to modern strategies of ethical resistance and social accountability. Educational programs began including excerpts from her diary and trial documents in lessons about slavery, gender, and agency, providing students with a nuanced understanding of historical oppression and the multifaceted forms of resistance it inspired. The rediscovery of her diary in 1923 was a watershed moment in the preservation of her legacy. While the diary remained largely unpublished, excerpts appeared in academic papers and historical journals beginning in the mid. Scholars praised the clarity, intelligence, and strategic insight reflected in her writing, noting how she carefully documented not only her father's plans, but also the network of support that enabled her survival and subsequent success. This documentation offered an unparalleled perspective on the inner workings of resistance within the plantation system, providing detailed evidence of the organizational capabilities, strategic thinking, and interpersonal skills employed by those subjected to oppression. Margaret's life also began to influence modern museum and cultural initiatives. Historical societies and museums in Philadelphia and Virginia started including her story in exhibitions, focusing on the Underground Railroad, women's agency, and the legal dimensions of resistance to slavery. Interactive exhibits allowed visitors to trace her journey from the quarters of Langford Plantation to the safe houses of Pennsylvania, providing a tangible sense of the danger, strategy, and courage involved in her escape. Students and visitors were particularly struck by the duality of her position, a white woman oppressed by her father's tyranny, yet reliant on the ingenuity and solidarity of enslaved black women, highlighting the complex intersections of race, gender, and power. In addition to museum exhibits, local schools in Philadelphia and surrounding counties began incorporating her story into curricula on American history and social studies. Students learned not only about slavery and the Underground Railroad, but also about ethical leadership, strategic thinking, and community empowerment. Teachers emphasized that Margaret's story exemplified how ordinary individuals could exercise agency under oppressive circumstances, and how moral courage combined with practical intelligence could produce far-reaching social impact. Lesson plans encouraged students to analyze her decisions, the risks she and her allies took, and the broader societal implications of her actions, fostering critical thinking and ethical reflection. Public recognition of Margaret Langford's contributions increased in the late 20th. Historical markers were installed near sites associated with her life, including locations of safe houses she had helped maintain and neighborhoods in Philadelphia, where she had established mentorship programs. Local historians organized walking tours and lectures, bringing attention to both her story and the broader networks of resistance that had often been overlooked in mainstream historical narrative. These initiatives helped contextualize her life within the broader history of slavery, legal struggle, and African American resistance, demonstrating that her contributions extended far beyond her immediate survival. Margaret's influence also permeated legal scholarship. Lawyers and academics studying cases of inheritance fraud, abuse of power, and ethical resistance drew parallels between her legal strategies and contemporary approaches to justice. Her meticulous documentation, careful strategic planning, and ethical prioritization of protecting allies provided a model for integrating moral responsibility into legal action. Case studies in law schools occasionally referenced her experience as an example of navigating complex legal systems with intelligence, foresight, and ethical clarity, illustrating the relevance of historical lessons to modern challenges. In literature and popular culture, Margaret's story inspired novels, short stories, and historical fiction. Authors explored the tension between her privileged upbringing and her later reliance on the skills, intelligence, and solidarity of the enslaved women who aided her. These works highlighted themes of resilience, moral courage, and the intersectionality of oppression, often emphasizing that true agency required both strategy and community. While creative liberties were sometimes taken to fill gaps in the historical record, the essence of her story, her escape, her legal triumph, and her philanthropic vision, remained intact, inspiring readers with examples of ethical and strategic resistance. Margaret's legacy also had a tangible impact on philanthropy and community organizing. Inspired by her example, activists and community leaders emphasized the importance of long-term support structures, mentorship, and strategic allocation of resources. The safe houses, schools, and mentorship networks she had initiated became models for programs addressing social justice, education, and empowerment in African American community. Her insistence on combining ethical guidance with practical skills training influenced modern approaches to community development, particularly programs designed to foster resilience and agency among marginalized populations. In Philadelphia, her influence became particularly visible through the informal networks she had established with Sadi, Ruth, and Paige. These networks evolved into organized community programs that provided temporary refuge, education, and vocational training for vulnerable populations, including fugitive slaves and later impoverished youth. Margaret's emphasis on planning, careful documentation, and ethical responsibility informed program design, ensuring that these initiatives were sustainable and adaptable to changing social conditions. Her legacy thus became embedded, not only in historical memory, but in practical social innovation. Academic scholarship has continued to explore the broader implications of Margaret's life. Researchers studying the intersections of race, gender, and power in antebellum America have highlighted her experience as an example of how systems of oppression could be resisted through strategic intelligence, ethical action, and communal solidarity. Her story challenges simplistic narratives about privilege and victimhood, demonstrating that agency and resistance often operate in complex, nuanced ways. Margaret's example provides a framework for understanding historical resilience, illustrating how strategic planning, ethical foresight, and community collaboration can produce profound social outcomes. In recent years, efforts to digitize and preserve documents related to Margaret Langford have expanded access to her story. Scholars, genealogists, and educators now have unprecedented opportunities to study her diary excerpts, court documents, and correspondence. Online exhibits, digital archives, and interactive maps allow users to trace her journey from Virginia to Pennsylvania, explore her networks, and analyze the strategies she employed. These digital initiatives ensure that her story remains accessible, relevant and instructive for contemporary audiences, reinforcing her enduring influence on historical understanding, social justice, and ethical leadership. Margaret's story also resonates in discussions about intersectionality and the complexity of oppression. Her experience demonstrates that privilege does not automatically confer immunity from abuse and that oppression can take many forms, including psychological manipulation, exploitation of trust, and threats to life itself. The solidarity she received from women in the quarters underscores the importance of alliances across social divides, highlighting the power of empathy, strategic collaboration, and moral courage in overcoming systemic injustice. Her life illustrates that true freedom requires both individual agency and collective support, a lesson that continues to inform contemporary debates about social justice and human rights. Today, Margaret Langford's story is recognized as a vital component of the broader narrative of resistance and empowerment in American history. Her escape, legal victory, and philanthropic work illustrate that ethical leadership, strategic foresight, and commitment to community can have lasting impact, even in the most challenging circumstances. She serves as a model for educators, activists, historians, and community organizers, demonstrating how individual courage and intelligence can translate into transformative social action. Margaret Langford's legacy is preserved in multiple forms through the historical record, oral histories, educational curricula, digital archives, museum exhibits, and cultural representation. Each of these mediums reinforces different aspects of her life and influence, from her personal bravery, to her strategic brilliance, ethical clarity, and commitment to community empowerment. Collectively, they ensure that her story remains a touchstone for understanding the complexities of oppression, resistance, and social responsibility. Her life provides enduring lessons about resilience, strategy, and moral courage. Margaret Langford exemplifies how individuals can confront systemic injustice, leverage their skills and resources, and empower others while navigating extreme personal danger. Her story reminds us that history is shaped not only by those in positions of formal power, but also by those who act with foresight, courage, and ethical conviction to resist oppression and create lasting change. Ultimately, Margaret Langford's story endures because it demonstrates the profound impact of combining strategic intelligence, ethical action, and community support. She transformed personal trauma into collective empowerment, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire, educate, and guide future generations. Her life serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, courage, strategy, and ethical leadership can illuminate a path to justice, freedom, and lasting social impact.